Good morning. Welcome to Finding Forrest Fenn, the case for New Mexico, the best evidence. Let me start by saying I titled this Finding Forrest Fenn because I believe the chase was about finding out who Forrest Fenn was as a person, finding out the things that Forrest loved, the things that he coveted the most, or how someone was going to solve the poem. The case for New Mexico is simply that. I'm just pointing out clues within the stories, the poem, the interviews that led people to believe the chest was it within New Mexico. I'm giving you the best evidence for that because I hear time and time again, well, the chest was found in Wyoming. Why are you so determined that it was in New Mexico? And so I'm going to point out some of that evidence. It's certainly not all inclusive. There were tons of things that I didn't include here that it pointed to places within New Mexico, but I wanted to limit this to kind of the best stuff that I found. Others of you may have readily found other locations and things that you feel hints that you feel pointed to other places, maybe even within New Mexico or other states. And that's certainly fine. You know, all of this is based on my interpretation and my opinion alone. So I'm going to start with simply a disclaimer that everything here is just that. It's my opinion. It's based on my interpretation of the books, the videos, the writings, the interviews. Nothing here should be construed as legal advice or in any way insinuating that any person related to the chase, is in any way responsible for a fraud or deception, deceit. I'm not going to get into that aspect of it. I'm simply providing evidence that I believe points you to New Mexico itself, not even my solution, the location that I think it was at, strictly New Mexico as a state. I do recognize that there are things that could exist that are, unknown to me and things that are known that are just misinterpreted that could affect the conclusion of how this thing ended up. And so I'm just providing an interpretation to clues that I think are reasonable inferences that the chest was originally hidden in New Mexico, or at least the 9 clues pointed you to a location within the state of New Mexico. So that being said, I'm going to start with what I call the case for common sense. And I'm going to take some absolutes, some things that we know absolutely, and draw some inferences from those. So the first thing is that Fenn hit a chest somewhere around the summer of 2010 in the mountains north of Santa Fe, he says. Now, whether you believe it was before the summer of 2010 or not, he tells you he hit it when he was 79 or 80. So that kind of gives you a window there. The language in the mountains north of Santa Fe, to me, is what's key. I believe when he first started this, his intention was to point to New Mexico all along. I think he was probably shocked when he found out that people were searching as far north as Wyoming and even all the way up into Canada. I think people were searching up there for a while. And I think he just went with it. I'll give Toby Eunice credit. I saw this on Toby's show, and there were certainly a lot of us that drew the same conclusion. But, if I say that I'm going fishing north of Santa Fe, you're automatically going to interpret that as I'm going fishing somewhere within the state of New Mexico, north of Santa Fe. You're not going to conclude that I'm going fishing up around Denver, because I gave you a geographical marker, Santa Fe, that gives you a region or an area in which to hone in on that I'm going to be fishing. Now, later, when he changes this verbiage to the Rocky Mountains, now that changes the search area because the Rocky Mountains spanned farther north than just New Mexico. And I believe that was purposeful. There was also an interview that K-Pro did with Doug Preston. And in that interview, Preston says something that initially he told Forrest that it was too easy. Now, we know that Preston has said he didn't know the exact location of the chest, but it doesn't mean that he didn't know the state. And so I think it's logical to infer here that Doug Preston is talking to Forrest and saying, look, people think it's in Colorado and Wyoming, Montana. Let's let them think that. But just narrowing it down just to New Mexico is too easy. Somebody's going to find it quickly. And I think that's what's going on there. The second thing I would point to is that, most of his adult life, he lived in Santa Fe. It was his home. It was convenient for him to hide the chest there, and it was convenient for him to retrieve it if he needed to retrieve it. He made his fortune when he was in New Mexico, and he made his fortune in art and antiquities, and he loved the state. And so I think he saw this as a way to give back. When he initially in the early years talks about people searching for the chest, and there's been 100,000, 200, 400,000 people searching. Where does he say they're searching? He says they're searching in New Mexico. And so, I think that was, again, the intent all along, and that people just took it outside the bounds of New Mexico, and Fenn went with it. One thing we know Fenn said is that he hid the chest alone. Again, New Mexico is the easiest place for him to accomplish this if you're going to do it alone as a 79 or 80-year-old man. We know at that time he had already let his pilot's license lapse and his ratings. The pilot's license, to my understanding, they don't expire, but your ratings have to be re-upped every couple of years. And, if you lose those ratings, you're not supposed to fly. We also know he sold his aircraft about 10 years earlier. So he didn't have a plane. So this notion that he got into a plane and flew somewhere and did this doesn't make sense. Now, I've heard people say, well, maybe Shiloh flew it. Well, then that would go against he did this alone. I've heard people say, well, maybe he took a commercial airline, and that just, I laugh when I hear that. I mean, try to get on a commercial airline carrying about $5,000 worth of cash and see what happens. They're going to run you through the ringer. Imagine getting on a flight with 40 pounds of gold. There's just no way that they're going to let that happen. So, this idea that he flew a commercial airline somewhere is preposterous. The next thing I would point you to is the 2013 interview with Lauren Mills. Now, interestingly enough, Fenn did this interview 3 times. Once a year, I think 2011, 2012, he did an interview each of those years with Mills as well. And basically, they go over the same thing. In the third interview, though, he talks about the bell jars, and he specifically says he hid the 8 bell jars in New Mexico. I think this was a huge slip up. And why this is a huge slip up? Well, again, it goes into my other points that New Mexico was the most convenient location for him to hide these bell jars. He loved the state. These bell jars were his legacy. When he talks about them, he says, imagine somebody digging these up in 1,000 years. And, they've got my name on it. They want to know who this guy was that did this. And we know that this was the same time period in which he hit the chest. So you're telling me these bell jars are so important that he didn't take one or two of them to Wyoming to hide? It just doesn't make sense that if the chest was in Wyoming, why wouldn't he hide the bell jars there? It makes more sense that he hid all of them within New Mexico. The next thing I would point to is the 2015 interview on Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates. And in that report, Gates makes a comment that on the day Fenn hid the chest, his wife, Peggy, didn't even know he had left the house. Now, that's hugely important, right? Because if he didn't fly there, it means he had to drive. And if his wife didn't know he left the house, that gives him a window of maybe 6 hours, maybe 8 hours at most. You can't get past the northern border of New Mexico and back and hide the chest and take 2 trips and all of that stuff, in under probably 5.5 hours, 6 hours. So geographically, that's limiting. The only place he could have done that was in New Mexico. I've heard people, make the argument, well, they went on a family vacation to Wyoming, and she didn't know he had left the cabin that day or whatever. And it's like, again, let's use the common sense. So nobody noticed the box containing the clanking gold and coins and all of that in the car right there. Where did he hide? Where would he hide the chest that nobody else would see it? Are you really going to, put that chest in the car, make the drive? I mean, you're going to be a nervous wreck about security and somebody seeing it, getting it stolen. What if you're in an accident? There's just a million considerations when you think about taking that on an overnight trip with you. So, all right, finally, the last common sense thing was Fenn knew New Mexico the best out of all of the states. And he knew that because he searched for artifacts within New Mexico during his adult time period. Yes, he went to Yellowstone and Wyoming every year and fished when he was a kid. So he certainly knew Wyoming. But when it comes to actually knowing the state itself and the thing about the state, New Mexico, he certainly knew the best, because all of the places that he hunted for artifacts, he knew things about the tribes, the ancient natives that lived in that area. And he talks about that over and over and over again in the stories. About the cultural and historical aspects of the things that he found. Remember, Fenn didn't go out and buy a stretch of river so he could trout fish the rest of his life. Fenn went out and bought a pueblo where he could search for artifacts. This was the thing he loved the most, was artifact searching. And that was the thrill of the chase for him. He talked about the thrill of the chase being, finding arrowheads and how excited he was and how excited his dad was to get to share that with him. That's what he's talking about when he's talking about the thrill of the chase. Also remember that Fenn said that it took him years to engineer this poem, that he wrote it and engineered it. So in order to do that, you have to know a place inside and out. You have to have advanced knowledge of a location if you're going to do this, because remember, you have a 10 by 10 box and you're going to leave clues for people to find that box. How are you going to accomplish that? Well, the only way to accomplish that is that if the clues lead you to geographic locations. That's the only thing that makes sense. I can't have a clue that says, find a rock with a mark on it. Well, what kind of clue is that? Because there's a million rocks with marks on them. That's not a clue. And so, in order to accomplish this, I think Fenn used the scrapbooks. They were the blueprint, and they were the blueprint to point you back to New Mexico and locations around New Mexico. And so, when Dale started the scrapbooks, and the first one in there is a picture of Forrest, or actually a picture of Forrest's granddaughter, and she's fishing. And that this is something he loves, right? He loves family, he loves fishing. But then, Dale also tells you that Forrest is a collector, and that Dale didn't even really fully understand what that meant until later on. And I agree with him, is that when you really get into who Forrest Fenn was, he was a collector, and he loved searching for the next thing. That was his thrill. Yes, he enjoyed fishing, but he enjoyed collecting way, way more. That's how he made his living as an adult, was collecting and reselling. And finally, the scrapbooks point you to his love of the native culture. And again, that goes directly back to the artifacts he was collecting. He wanted to know the history behind those things, who the people were that created them. And I will certainly give credit to Barbara Anderson. I think Barbara did a real good job going through the scrapbooks. And the one thing that Barbara points out, and that I think everyone needs to take heed, is the reoccurring themes within the scrapbooks, across the scrapbooks, into the books themselves. There are reoccurring themes, and he's pointing you to those. And there's a reason he has to do that. Think about it. If you don't know what's a clue, then you don't know what's a clue. If everything is a clue, nothing is a clue. Fenn has to have a way to prompt you that there is a clue in here and that you need to find it. And the only way he can do that is that if there are aberrations, things that are out of place, that you focus in on and say, that's not right. What's he trying to tell me here? That's how you decipher the scrapbooks and even the stories within the books themselves, because I'm going to point to a few of those. In scrapbook 4, Fenn gives you the best clue. This is the story about him flying Barry Goldwater back to Arizona. And he tells you how impressed he was that Goldwater knew every little town, canyon, and mountain by name. This is what Forrest is telling you. If you want to solve this, you need to know every little town, canyon, and mountain by name. If I'm going to give you hints, those hints have to be geographic if they're going to do you any good at all. Again, I can't tell you there's a mark on a tree. There's millions of marks on a tree. But what I can do is geographically point to a location so that you know you're in the right spot. And that's what these scrapbooks do. And I'm going to point out a few of these. Again, all of these pointing to New Mexico. So in scrapbook 7, this is the picture of Forrest and Peggy and Michael Douglas standing in front of a painting that Forrest says is a Georgia O'Keeffe. And many of you will know Georgia O'Keeffe was a New Mexico painter. But this is an overt thing, right? That this is nothing hidden. However, if you know Georgia O'Keeffe's work, you immediately recognize the painting behind cannot be a Georgia O'Keeffe. It's just not abstract enough to be an O'Keeffe. This is a Wilson Hurley, and Fenn actually does a story on Wilson Hurley in one of the books. I think it's in Too Far to Walk. He points out some Wilson Hurley. It may be in Once Upon a While. But in one of the latter books, he has some Wilson Hurley paintings. And Hurley is a landscape artist. But in his landscapes, he usually includes thunderstorms or these really, billowing cloud features. And so if you know Wilson Hurley, you immediately recognize the painting behind as a Wilson Hurley. Fenn knows the difference between an O'Keeffe and a Hurley. I mean, he was an art dealer, for God's sake. He knew that wasn't an O'Keeffe. He's pointing you to the fact this is the aberration. Again, you had to know Fenn, you had to know the things he liked, which are art, and you had to know to look at who this painting was actually done by. And of course, on the right, I've got a print of the Hurley painting that you can see for comparison. It's the same painting. But what is key here, because Wilson Hurley also painted Wyoming. That's the trick here, is Hurley painted Mexico and he painted Wyoming. However, the particular painting they're standing in front is a part of a series of paintings entitled the New Mexico Suite. This is the hidden clue. This is what Fenn is pointing you to, is that the chest is hidden in New Mexico. Scrapbook 10. And again, I'm going to go over a few of these. I'm not going over all of them. There are other scrapbooks that point to different things within New Mexico itself that I chose not to choose here, that I chose not to include here. I didn't want to be going on for hours and hours. Again, just the best evidence. So Scrapbook 10 is the story of Wolfgang Pogzeba. He's an artist that Fenn knows. Pogzeba died in a plane crash coming from, I believe, Utah. He was coming on his way back to Taos, actually carrying one of Forrest's personal paintings of a Joseph Sharp. So the scrapbook doesn't tell you the location of the crash. Now, the story is retold in Too Far to Walk. I think it's Wolfie and Onwen is the name of the chapter. And in the chapter, he tells you it was on the Jicarilla Indian Reservation. I believe that's an Apache Indian reservation to the north and west of Santa Fe. However, the fact that the scrapbook didn't tell you the location, I wanted to check to see, is the location in the story accurate? So I looked it up. And when I looked it up, I actually found that the crash site was in Canelone, New Mexico, or Cangelone, I don't know how you pronounce it. It was on a mountain peak at about 10,000 feet. Fenn actually went and searched for the crash after it had happened in his own plane. But again, he's pointing you to New Mexico, and specifically the location around this particular peak. I don't think he's honing in on the peak. I think he's just pointing you to a location within the state. So scrapbooks 14 and 85 are basically the same story. It's the story of Forrest and his relationship with Donna Karen and her husband. In the first scrapbook, Fenn misspells her name Karen. In the second scrapbook, he spells it correctly, Karan. He certainly knew he was misspelling her name in the first scrapbook. And in fact, I emailed Dale Neitzel and asked him when he received the story if Fenn provided the spelling, and he did confirm that Fenn provided the spelling. So the question here is, how does substituting the E for the A in Karen provide you some sort of geographic clue? Well, there's a million cities. And so, it can't be pointing to a city. It's got to be something more general if you're going to pick up on it. Here, New Mexico is the only search state that contains the letter E in it. And Fenn does this in another scrapbook later on, where he substitutes an E for an A. And again, the same sort of logic. I think he's pointing you to New Mexico. Scrapbook 20 is a picture of a fox in Finn's backyard. You have to ask yourself, why is this important? Why is he including this? Foxes are actually found in all 50 states. However, you have to ask yourself, what is particular about this fox? You know, what is it about this fox that's special? And if you notice the tail, there's a black tip on the tail, and that should be a clue. And if you look up the fox, you're going to find out that this is actually a certain breed of fox called a kit fox. And these are only found in the desert Southwest. So within the search states, New Mexico is the only search state that has these. There may be a few in southern Colorado, but for the most part, they're only in New Mexico and Arizona and west. They don't go any farther than really northern New Mexico, and they're certainly not up in Wyoming and Montana. Scrapbook 105. So this is a scrapbook talking about Forrest creating his own art. He doesn't really consider himself an artist, but he says sometimes certain things remind him of other things. And so in the photo, he has the photo on the left simply labeled Miss Ford. So he's telling you that this image somehow reminds him of Miss Ford. Well, who was Miss Ford? If you remember from the stories, Miss Ford was his Spanish teacher. So if you look up Ford in Spanish, you come up with the word vado, V-A-D-O, means Ford. There's one state that has a geographic location as Vado, and that's El Vado Reservoir, which is north of Santa Fe. And if you look specifically at the bottom of the image he's created, there's a very unique shape that resembles El Vado Reservoir. And I've got a satellite image and also have the maps image of it. And you can see that very unique inlet there. It looks like sort of like a bird's head and a beak. This is what he's pointing you to. Again, this is a location in New Mexico that's important to the chase. Scrapbook 124. This is the other one I was telling you where he substitutes an E for an A. In this scrapbook, he misspells the word leave, and he spells it L-E-E-V-E. Again, you have to ask yourself, why are you putting an E instead of an A? Pointing to New Mexico as being the only search state containing the letter E. Images from the book. Okay, so I'm going to point you to the thrill of the chase, jump-starting the learning curve. Again, this is the story of his Spanish teacher, Miss Ford. If you look up the word Ford, you get Vado. Looking at the image contained within the story on page 25. Now, if you know and seen Norman Rockwell images, you recognize this image. This is one that Fenn took from Norman Rockwell. But you have to look at the image and say, what's different? What is different here in this image? And if you look behind the dad, you see there's been a bookshelf that's added and sort of an area that is highlighted, a very unique kind of triangular area. Well, if you look at El Vado Reservoir Dam, it's the spinning image of that shape. I included an image here of El Vado. If you're actually ground level, looking straight on, the top right of the dam is obscured by the hill, so you can't see it, and it looks exactly like the image contained here. So again, a location within New Mexico. So I'll next point you to page 49, The Thrill of the Chase. This is the Great Totem Cafe Caper. This is the story about Fenn working as the dishwasher, and he steals the pie. couple of cues in this story. He uses temperate words such as frosty, scalding, and he's referring, here he's referring to the scalding water that washed his hands. I believe these are hidden clues to warm waters. So I will tell you that this was my warm waters halt, not only for this reason, but for some other reasons as well that I won't get into. But if you notice Frosty's apron here, the things in black, I believe, are the water. And if you look at that general outline, it generally follows the outline of Abiquiu Reservoir, Lake Abiquiu, which is north of Santa Fe. The apron strap being the Chama River and flowing in. But if you want to just argue and say, well, that's coincidental, it sort of looks like that, take a look at Forrest's shirt. Now, if you orient the picture correctly and kind of rotate Lake Abiquiu in the direction that it actually geographically sits, he's pointing directly toward Lake Heron. Now, notice the resemblance in Forrest's shirt and Lake Heron on the far right. Again, if you want to say it's coincidental, okay, fine. I'm probably not going to win the coincidental argument, but there's only so many coincidences you can chalk up before you have to say this is intentional. And in fact, if you look at satellite images over Lake Heron, notice the pie Forrest is holding. You can actually see geographic resemblances of the pie from satellite images. It's really freaky. So again, pointing to New Mexico. All right, the next one I'm going to talk about is in the thrill of the chase, the story Tea with Olga. Now, I want to point you to a couple of things. First, you need to take note of the date stamp of October 10th, 1983, because that plays in. But this is the story of Forrest Fenn, who is dying of cancer. Her name is Olga Svoboda, and she lives in Forrest guest house. And she asked Fenn that when she dies, she wants her ashes spread across Taos Mountain. And there's a picture of Forrest supposedly over Taos Mountain dumping her ashes. Well, if you look at the death records of Olga Svoboda, you note that she actually died on February 1st, 1979. So this is about 3.5 years before the date stamp on the story. Keep that in mind. However, many of you recognize this story as the story of Georgia O'Keeffe. Again, O'Keeffe was a New Mexico painter. However, she had her ashes spread atop Cerro Pedernal, one of the mountains that she loved to paint. It was outside of Abiquiu. It's got a very unique, if you look in the center photo, it's got a very unique shape to it, easily recognizable by anyone. If you look at the photo in Tea with Olga of Fenn over the mountain, you're going to notice that the vegetation in the foothills leading up to the mountain, which is purposely obscured behind the plane and in the clouds, you're going to notice that it's sparsely vegetated. Well, if you look at the foothills leading up to Taos Mountain, they're completely forested. They look nothing like the image. However, if you look at the image of Cerro Pedernal, the foothills are identical. There's sparse vegetation leading up. And I will also note that Georgia O'Keeffe died on March 6, 1986. Now tell me this is a coincidence. If you take the dates between Svoboda's death and O'Keeffe's death, it works out exactly to October 10th, 1983. Forrest combined the two stories into one story. And that's what he's getting you here. That's the aberration, is that he's combined this. The hidden location is Cerro Perdonal. This is important to him. Another thing he tells you in the story is that when he got in his plane, he says he flew north from Santa Fe. Well, Taos Mountain is north by northeast of Santa Fe, really more east by northeast of Santa Fe. It's not directly north. What is directly north is Cerro Perdonal. It's magnetic, the magnetic north from Santa Fe is Cerro Perdonal. Takes you right over it. So again, another clue. Finally, I would point out the name of the story was Tea with Olga. Interestingly enough, near Cerro Perdonal is the land formation Tea Kettle Rock, which I think is another hidden clue to this particular story. All right, going to jump to the book Too Far to Walk, the story I wish I hadn't. This is the story where Fenn describes shooting the mountain lion in what he says is White Horse Canyon in Arizona. However, if you look up White Horse Canyon in Arizona, you're going to find it's a red rock canyon. Looks nothing like the photos behind. Just so happened that I recognized the canyon behind him because I've been to this particular canyon. If you look at Forrest's face, notice there is a rock formation that is highlighted, just to the left and below his chin. That formation actually runs, and you can see it again around his eye. That actually juts out from the side of that cliff and is probably 30 feet long, if I had to guess. It's a very unique rock formation. Now, again, you have to think this photo was taken 40 plus years ago with a Polaroid. So you're not going to have the best resolution, but you certainly can see the rock. I recognize the rock. And if you look to the right, I didn't have a photo standing at this location, but I was able to get on Google Earth and get relatively close. Now, again, the vegetation's grown up, but if you look just left of center, you can see the long rock formation there on the side of the cliff. And you can actually match up some of the highlighted rocks to the right up on the photo itself. They're still there. And this is a location in New Mexico where I actually believe is not far from the treasure site called Rito Resumadero Canyon. Again, the formations are very unique. I'm 100% convinced this is where Fenn is standing. So you have to ask yourself, why go out of your way to change the location? White Horse Canyon doesn't add anything, but what it does add is it's an aberration. And if you find the true location, again, it's within New Mexico. Another story from Too Far to Walk. Me and Charmaine, or Charmaine and Me, I can't remember how it was titled. But it's Fenn's relationship with Charmaine Allred, who Fenn takes to San Lazaro Pueblo to hunt for artifacts. This was their thing together. I actually did some research online, and I found where Forrest and Charmaine were both contributors to the Mesa Prieta petroglyph project. Now, Mesa Prieta is just north and west of Lake Abiquiu. There's a petroglyph project that's actually in a different location, but the mountain itself is to the north and to the west of Lake Abiquiu. The image, though, below, the drawn image, appears a couple of times. It appears in the photo on the left that I took. It also appears on the box. If you remember the native girls bending down, opening the lid of the jar that's hidden underground, the box inside contains that image. Well, Mesa Prieta happens to actually have that image. It's the only location that that particular image exists. And again, it's in New Mexico. I would point out that Prieta in Spanish is a form of brown. This was my home of brown. This is where I believe Forrest was talking about. Okay, other hints from the book, I'll go back to the thrill of the chase, the story, me in the middle, page 35. If you break this down, the word me actually is in the middle of New Mexico. Obviously, the only state that this happens in. I believe this was another hidden clue. Other references, look at the poem itself. When he talks about warm waters halt, the water is plural. This is a distinguishing feature that New Mexico alone differentiates using the plural form. Obviously, as a fisherman, this was something that Forrest would have known, and I believed he utilized this in the poem as a geographic locator. All right, in one of the extras, Fenn Extra Passage 2, you have it's titled Loom of the Desert. I believe there's a couple of clues in Loom of the Desert. One of them is a location clue, but I want to point it out, the general clue to New Mexico that was provided in this. If you see the natives, there's a mountain back behind them, or a mesa, excuse me, back behind them. This mesa is in northern New Mexico again. It's a photo of Mesa de los Viejos, or Table of the Old. I've included a couple of pictures. I tried to get the best pictures I could of the area. You're going to have to think, this photo was probably taken in the 1900s, so you're losing some resolution in the photo. But I took some Google Earth images and included them here. This is the same mesa, no doubt about it. I couldn't get the exact angle that they were at when the photo was taken, obviously, but you can certainly point out a lot of the highlight similarities in the rock features. Finally, I'm going to point to some slip-ups in the interviews. This has been brought out before, but again, pointing to New Mexico, we've got the 2015 unedited New Mexico True Stories interview. He says a couple of things in here. First of all, he says it's in a place that's very dear to him, but he doesn't want to give the time location in which it became dear to him. And that's important, because if the time location is when he was a child, then I would say, hey, it's probably a good argument for Yellowstone, because that's when that area was important to him. However, as an adult, New Mexico was what was important to him. Again, he made his living there. He hunted for artifacts there. Everything he did was in New Mexico. New Mexico made him rich. And I think that's the reason why he doesn't want to give you the particular time frame. He also says the treasure is not buried where you're going to find it. I think that's telling. We saw some images of the chest purportedly buried up to the lid. Not sure how you rectify that, but I found the statement itself very unique. And finally, Fenn says that while you're standing at the treasure, you're going to smell the wonderful smell of pine needles or pinyon nuts, sagebrush. Obviously, the inclusion of pinyon rules out Wyoming and Montana, since pinyon does not grow in those states. Yes, he later purportedly came back and retracted this statement. But what choice did he have? He just ruled out 2 search states. He had to retract it. Keep in mind at the end of the interview, because this is telling. Fenn knows he screwed up when he says pinyon nuts. I mean, you can actually read his face, and he realizes that he said something. Now, ironically, at the end, they're trying to prompt Fenn. The interviewer is trying to prompt Fenn to say, hey, I've said something, I've said too much. And throughout the interview, Forrest is having a hard time hearing the interviewer and understanding him. If you watch the unedited version, Fenn is constantly having him repeat the question, or Fenn misinterprets the question or whatever. However, at this point in time, Forrest does say something. He says that I told you something I wish I had not. And I think Forrest is answering his question or his request to make the statement, but I think he's actually making a true statement here, that I told you something I wish I had not. Now, if I told you something incorrectly, I'm going to say, hey, I made a mistake. I said something incorrectly. I'm not going to say I told you something I wish I had not, because the inference here is I told you something truthful that I wish I hadn't, but I did. He doesn't say that. He doesn't take the opportunity to clear the record at the interview. He doesn't do this. And the reason is because he told the truth. It was only later, after he thought about it, when he realized, hey, I've got to go back and clear the record on this, because I basically just ruled out 2 search states. Doesn't do that in the interview. So that's it, folks. That is the best evidence that I can present at this point in time that this chest was located in New Mexico. I would certainly love to hear if others of you found things that pointed to New Mexico as well. If you want to email me, my email is nmtreasurehunter@gmail.com. So New Mexico Treasure Hunter, nmtreasurehunter@gmail.com.